Welcome to The Art of Growth. This is Jim Zartman, and today Joel Hubbard and I are responding to some call-ins. We had put out a request on our newsletter and on Instagram about wanting to hear stories where you've experienced some negative consequences as you've tried to grow. And so we're talking about this, and we use it as a jumping off point for some other things where it took us. And this is in a series. We've been talking about this for a few weeks now. But before we jump in with today's episode and our call-ins, you can go to theartofgrowth.org to take a free Enneagram test or free instincts test. And it's really the combo of those two things that help you have a better sense of who you are. And that's the best place to reach out to us if you're interested in having us work with your team to improve communication, productive conflict, and trust. And that's also where you can sign up for the next round of certification or join the next Q&A that we're going to have for people who are interested in certification to really go deeper into your own Enneagram experience. But for now, let's go ahead and jump in with this week's episode.
Hi, Jim and Joel. This is Marcella from Switzerland. I'm sending this recording through in response to your request for testimonials around how growth can disrupt family systems and patterns, and specifically how you said that people around you come to rely on that predictability of the members of the group. And I think back when I started yoga, and through that started really putting things in different perspectives. I was exposed to a different community, started asking myself questions. For me, that was the beginning of the journey that then brought me to the Enneagram. I was married, had a family with small children. Things little by little, I changed the way I was showing up within that family dynamic, which then led eventually to separation. But before we got to that, the discussions that I tried to have, sharing different ways that I wanted to do things differently, how I wanted to do things differently, how, for me, values were starting to shift a little bit, putting things into perspective, living in a different country, and so forth. As I started to share them with my husband, he really was not okay with that. I remember the final sentence that clenched it for me was when he shouted back, you changed. I never change. And that was for me what really sealed it. We couldn't move forward. And that's when we then decided to separate. So voila, please know that I'm still a regular follower of The Art of Growth, the wonderful work that you do, the podcasts, and of course, I still carry big 7 enthusiasm for the Enneagram. Sending you lots of love from cold Switzerland. Bye for now.
Well, thank you so much, Marcella. This is what makes me think of how many times our invitation to growth does not come through a very clear or simple or obvious way. There's almost no strategy to how that happens. It's like the invitation or challenge, whichever one it is for us, is this interruption in our normal life. It's like life is going on. We're in our circle. We're in our enjoying life, oblivious oftentimes to our own internal experiences, the subconscious, the stuff that's going on underneath, until something wakes that up. And when it does wake it up, you have this sense of like, wow, I've tolerated this or put this for a long time. But while you were doing it, it wasn't as acute. You weren't as aware of the difficulty that it now feels really highlighted for you. And I think that that's true for all of us. I think of so many stories I've heard of people who were like in some kind of environment where life is going on until there's a wound. And then that wound causes them to wake up to something. And then that's when they begin to create some boundaries for themselves. And that's what sounds like happened for you, Marcella, is you're involved in yoga in a new community. And one of the things that's been said about I think we did this in Spiral Dynamics when we talked about this, is the complexity is what causes the human mind to have to change. When it's forced with new information, new experiences, that change begins to happen. So you had outside voices, you had these new experiences, and you wake up to some things, and then that's when you don't know that you can continue, and you can't really, because once you've started on the journey, it's very difficult to go backwards. It's very difficult to return. We try sometimes to go back, but it's near impossible at that point to do so. And so she, Marcella, you moved into this new space of, okay, now if I'm changing and I'm growing, how do I communicate that? You communicate that with your husband, and his response is that he doesn't change. And there are two things that came up, and this is where I think it'd be great to hear from you, Jim, because I think as an 8, you're going to resonate with the side of stability or of integrity and of holding on to your values and not adapting because of external stimuli, let's say. And then there are other people who are much more fluid in terms of their adaptability. And so they will shapeshift, they will adapt, they will, and this is not just a certain type, this is a bunch of types that will change or adapt based upon their environment. They're more affected by the environment.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to tease out in this story, is that there are these two experiences, and the sort of badge of honor for one type is, I never change.
Yeah.
And it's like a statement of saying, there are many of you who are so easily affected that you're maybe adapting, but it's not a real true transformation at the deepest levels. It's more of like a veneer. Like you've changed in order to fit in, let's say.
Right.
But then on the other side, it's like, yeah, but if you don't change and you don't grow, then that means you're not open to truth that may be outside of yourself.
I did wonder what he meant by change. I was wondering, I was like, does he mean like I'm consistent? I've been a consistent part in this, and that he felt like she lost some consistency. Because I also, since, English isn't their first language, I'm like, well, what was the word? Because, Germans have all these interesting words too. I think they speak German, right?
It's a few different languages.
It's
different
Swiss
parts
German,
of
Swiss German, yeah. There might be a word. I'm like, well, I do wonder about like what was kind of coming behind that. But there's a few different aspects of this that came to mind. One of them was, we talked about this several years ago, about the process of going from being asleep to something, asleep to awake, to aware. It's like these 3 stages. And a lot of times it sounds like when people are learning this, they're coming into a new community, they're seeing things about themselves. It's not so much that they've made huge growth steps yet, but it is a growth step in and of itself to suddenly go from being asleep to something to being aware. You've often talked about, what are the parts of yourself that you've exiled, that you've silenced, that you've had to adapt to in order to be at peace with your surroundings. And it sounds like, and I've heard her story and other stories, that people wake up to the realization that they had been silencing or as exiled a part of them for far too long, and they're awakening to it. And they're realizing, I can't keep this silent anymore. I can't continue to ignore something because it wasn't producing good things in me. Because even if you think you're trying to keep the peace and keep it silent, it's there. It's in the background, and it's wanting to come out. It's like holding that balloon underwater. It can only be held down for so long, and you can't do that. So you have to awake to it. And then moving from that awake phase to being aware, that's the transition of what do I do with this new information? And that's where stories get really complicated. They get really layered. It's really hard to say whether or not you're making the right decision with this new awareness. And I think a lot of times that takes years to know whether or not you made the right call, or what did I do with this information of being awake to it. And a lot of times, because we've awakened to something, we think that the step we're taking is growth. And sometimes it is, but it's nuanced, it's layered, and it's not always. Because sometimes we reach another layer of awareness and growth, and we realize, oh, I was kind of brash with the decisions I made. And I'm not saying specifically in this situation, I'm just saying there is this pattern that I notice in a lot of people when they move through those stages of asleep to awake to aware. When they come to awake, they're like, I've been doing this too long, and now I need to do this. And then they make decisions that they might make differently on their next awakening.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this yesterday in group coaching, which is when it comes to connection and relationships, it's really hard to answer both of these questions, which is how do you remain present to yourself without losing the other? And how do you stay present to the other without losing yourself? And the picture that came to mind is this hiking spot in Franconia Ridge up in the White Mountains where it just looks like a drop off on both sides. And it can feel like that sometimes. And so I think it's when it comes to that point, there's so many layers, there's so many nuances. Whenever someone is in this story in front of me, like I have lots of questions. I want to parse out a lot of different aspects of it because that's where, to me, it's complicated.
Yeah. So in the model that I have for growth and transformation, there's the state that you're in at the beginning, which is sort of a place of home. So that's a undifferentiated state. That's the womb.
Yeah.
And you're in this system. You're part of the system. The system is part of you. And then you're
a product
exiled.
of it.
You're a product of it, exactly. Yeah. Then you're exiled out of it, or you exile yourself out of it, one or the other. And when you do, you have to look at the other as, in some sense, as the problem, because I think it's part of the ordering of things. So you have to set things apart, like this is over here and this is over here. And we do that in extremes. People are afraid of getting it wrong, or people then think, maybe I did it wrong, I shouldn't have done it that way. But don't let perfection prevent you from moving forward, but rather look at it as a stage. Right now, I'm totally villainizing the other person. Totally. Yeah, they're the problem. And again, the wound is what wakes that up. So you have a wound, and then you exit. That's the exile. You leave, and then you're on the other side, and you're looking at that person, that system, that experience. You're looking at that as the villain, the enemy. And I think it's necessary. It's just, you've got to be honest with yourself and say that's a stage. Right. And I think as long as we keep it that way, then there's fluidity and there's ability to shift and change and not get stuck. Not get stuck at that point where it's like, oh, the enemy is the world around me or people that are this way or, and I'm the victim and therefore I don't see my own contribution to the system I was part of.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I needed to individuate myself from my family and community when I was 15, but I'm not an angry young man anymore.
Yeah, right. And they're not all this evil and these caricatures. And I think
layers, that's what I mean. It's layers, there's nuance. It's not simple.
No, it's not. People are not caricatures. But we need to put our pain onto something that's big enough to handle it. And that's the reason why we create these monsters in our minds. And this wound that I experience is so painful. This is, the evil doer of, or the cause of my pain. And I think that's okay for now. And then you recognize, like, I'm villainizing. I need to because my pain is so acute. Yeah. And then you move toward that more nuanced at the next stage where you look at it as, all right, I see my part. See how I was part of the whole problem. Now, again, we're expounding on this. So Marcello, this is not.
Yeah, it's we've touched on your story, but we're also jumping to like so many other stories like this that we've heard, and so it's like it's definitely like splintered into many different directions of different kinds of stories that we've heard, and it's impossible to leave our own out of it. Like,
oh no, totally. No, to say, Marcello, you had to make the decision that you made, and I think that's a value that you held on to for growth. That you insisted on continuing to grow, and kudos to you, man. It takes a lot to insist on growth because everything around you, the system that you are surrounded by, knows you a certain way and is not going to, as we said before, the system itself gets dysregulated when you change. So it's going to try to put you back in the position or the way you were before. So growth is difficult. And so I think that that's really good. And your value for continuing to grow and not get stuck in the same old for the sake of peace, harmony, for the sake of, keeping things from being uncomfortable. I mean, many of us do that. And it's like, well, we sacrifice our own growth for the sake of the familiar, for the sake of safety. And I think it takes a lot of courage to move forward despite that. And so I honor that in you, Marcella, and I think that's something that is to be celebrated, and for us to continue to have this as our big value is we have to grow if we're going to be healthy people.
Yeah, we've talked about this many times. A lot of times when we hit a new place and we're trying to grow, we do the new right thing in a messy, bad way.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And that is an important part of growth.
It is, yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's listen to the next story here from Karen.
I was just speaking about this with a couple of friends, but it's come up quite a bit. This concept of that as we grow and get healthier, especially being an Enneagram 9, it creates conflict and disruption and disconnection, which if you were to ask me what as a 9 I really most fear, it's not the conflict itself, it's the conflict that causes disconnection. And has this happened as I've grown in my mental health and my understanding of myself and self-awareness? 100%. I can think of specifically a friendship where I started to create what I would call boundaries. I don't even know if when I was initially doing it, I knew that I was creating boundaries, but I was starting to basically explain a need that I had and saying it in a way that was not confrontational, because I don't know that I even know how to do that as a 9. I'm sure I can. I can do that with my husband, who's an 8. But otherwise, I'm pretty even-keeled when it comes to explaining what I need. What I realized, and maybe it wasn't until the third time that I set a boundary with someone, and that looked like my son was in a mental health crisis. And I, as a family, we were trying to address it together, and I pulled back. And I said to this friend that I needed space. I'm sorry that I haven't been communicating, but I needed this space. So I didn't just withdraw, but I also explained why I was doing it. And when I met back with this particular person, it turned into being about how I had hurt them and how I had wounded them and how I needed to do it differently next time. And I just kind of took note of that. And then I think within, a few months of that, kind of the final thing that came about was communication about something we both cared deeply about in the news. And I explained that while we can agree to disagree on this, and I am going to do my work and I appreciate your input, what I don't need is you to send me kind of constant messaging about it. But I do appreciate what you have to say. And it was, again, just sort of this respect each other's differences. I don't need you to change your mind, and I don't need to change my mind, but we can agree to disagree. And this person basically just said goodbye. And it was the end of, for now, there was not an incident, there wasn't but it was the end of a relationship that if I look back over that relationship, I can look back to that one situation, but I can look further back and go, oh, I tried to set boundaries here and I named what I needed. And that other person wasn't able to live into that space. There definitely was a grief around it. There has been sort of this long processing of, should I reach back out? And especially as a 9, when I look at how our tendency is to want to then re-heal that relationship. And I absolutely have the capacity to do that. And instead of trying to fix it, trying to heal that space, make peace between us, I have kind of just let it go. I've just allowed it to be separate for now. I think it is the healthier choice. But that, again, leaving that disconnection is a little bit of a death in my world, in the world of a 9. But as I've stepped away from it, I can kind of have this bigger picture of, no, this is what health looks like. And it doesn't mean down the road that friendship doesn't rekindle or something doesn't happen, but it can't be just me working towards that. I need to keep my boundaries and my health as a priority as well. So hopefully that's helpful. All right. See you.
Karen, thank you so much. To your point about when you begin to create boundaries, people that are close to you may not like that very much. And you have always extended yourself to try to be the person, it sounds like, who is going above and beyond to go to the other side and then lose yourself in the process. So, Jim, you said earlier that, the two options, you either move towards yourself and lose others, or you go to others and lose yourself, something.
Yeah, we can fall off to either one of those cliffs, depending on who we are, yeah.
It sounds like, Karen, you're saying, oftentimes you've gone towards others, losing yourself and realizing like that is not good for me. And in the end, you're the one who's hurting, and your own needs aren't being taken into account. So that is a difficult thing, because that other person is someone that I'm sure you cared about, loved, and saw a lot of good in. But once you started saying, hey, I matter too. Yeah. So even the boundary around like, we can agree to disagree, but please don't keep peppering me with your supporting data and your belief on something to try to sway me to the other. It's like a self-respect thing.
Yeah.
So Karen, you're moving all the way. You're saying, wait a second, if this bothers me that you're trying to change my viewpoint, and that's not fair to me. That's the disrespect to me when I've already said, here's where I'm at, right? And I think that's good.
Yeah, and for some, what initiates it is exactly the kind of experience that she had. So for those who tend to over-accommodate others, who will silence themselves for the sake of others, a lot of times what shifts and awakens that is when they need to go to the defense of, or the protection of, the justice of someone who's close to them. And so she talked about like the situation of mental illness. And so there was a sense of right action where she might lose herself or over-accommodate if it has to do with her.
Right.
When it comes to someone else, it's all of a sudden that's actually where the ability to access boundaries that were inaccessible to your own life are suddenly accessible. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly this was a situation where it was like, when you accommodate often, other people get used to that and they expect that behavior. They expect to be able to sway you. And this person probably genuinely thought that they had your best interest in heart and were trying to give you sound advice, but you had a sense of right action. This is not right for me, for us, for my family. And so you drew a line. And that meant a pulling back because you were pulling back to defend something. So you were awakening to your own need for boundaries in a situation. And then once that gets awakened in a particular relationship, you don't really want to go back.
And you can do it for yourself now.
And you can do it for yourself now. Yeah. And so the first story, it was the boundary was activated because of the defense of the care for another person. And in the second story, it was, I have now established this boundary and I need this for myself.
Yeah.
And that to me is oh man, now you're more awake to it. Yeah. Now you're more aware. You're operating from a higher level of growth there.
I don't know there's much more to say, but Karen, that's fantastic. And, I know that that's not easy, and that's why we need to celebrate each other's growth, because there's a loss.
Yeah.
It's not like this is a win-win-win. Everybody wins. It's like I drew a boundary. I'm prioritizing my own self for the first time, or I should say I'm including care for myself.
That's a better way to say it, because this is something we've talked about with people who tend to really externally value that voice, value the external voice. We've talked about this before, where some listen to the external voice at the expense of the internal voice. And it's not about then suddenly excluding the external voice. It's about including your internal voice as well. Mm-hmm. So for those of us who have this sense or need or automatic reaction to over-accommodate, and you actually get in touch with your own voice, there may be a cost to that, but I don't think it's one that it comes with regret. It's can you include both of those voices, receive both, listen to both, and then take your right action from that point. And that's what I see, Karen doing in this story. And this is someone that we've known for a while, had learned with us in different capacities over multiple years. So I find it encouraging to see this in you, Karen, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. So
those are the only audios that were sent in, but I'm going to read a couple messages that we got. So here was the first one. It said, "Hi, Jim. Yes, here's a story about setting boundaries and experiencing the discomfort of changing a role. It's a twofer." It's interesting this is coming as a twofer too. And this one is also using this boundaries term we were just discussing. So this is from Mandy. So Mandy said, "I set a boundary around my time and my energy. I put years of my life towards volunteerism and contribution in a church setting where I felt needed and also required at times. It wasn't until I needed support of my own and pulled away, asking for space, but to remain in a relationship where I realized it was nearly all one-sided. When I set the boundary of not being able to contribute my time as a volunteer, but ask for connection and friendship outside of contribution, it was not reciprocated. It turned out that all of those coffee dates and text messages and phone calls that felt like friendship were really nurturing the contributions I made. Without my contributions, my time was of no interest. Confronting this became pretty heart-wrenching. Discomfort is part of that, as I needed to remain present and acknowledge my own role in the situation. But once I realized, I simply set limits on what I could offer and requested connection anyway. It was painful. Maintaining the boundary, as we know, is always where the work lies. Setting a boundary is easy, from her perspective. We all do it at times in different words. Reinforcing what we will accept and what we will not is challenging because our people are used to getting something from us in some way. And they don't often respond positively when we remove that offering as an option. Boundary setting in my friendship has taken on the form of becoming more direct with others in a tender and gentle way, but with clear honor to what I want and need as well. I didn't realize how many of my relationships weren't relationships, but transactional experiences based on proximity. That discomfort, that's a space for me to grieve all on my own so that when I return to a person, I can come with self-awareness that allows me to set a loving boundary for both of us. It's a new boundary that does not say this is what you cannot do, but rather this is how you can gain access to me and my life. It's allowing my positive desires to be valued and validated. I think this is the way forward in a culture where giving and generosity are highly prized. This is how I can give of myself and still maintain access to myself at the same time. Anyway, I hope that hits the mark of what you're asking for the show. Feel free to hit back with questions. Warmly, Mandy.
Well, thank you, Mandy. I think what you're articulating there is really helpful. I think you've laid out some ways to do boundaries that for you are not about pushing people away, but about a new way of actually interacting with you. So that's really good. One of my concerns, this is a little bit of a sidebar, one of my concerns with boundaries and the emphasis so much on it is either people that don't have them at all, or people that do them, and when they do them, they're just total barriers and they block people out, right? So you have a person who may be a particular type that leans more toward the others and in usually forgetting themselves in the process, or at least minimizing or diminishing their own particular needs. So they're all the way on the other side. They're serving other people, they're doing for other people, and then that runs out. Something happens where they realize, like, I'm doing all of this and it's not coming back my way. So then what happens is they say, well, the very thing I'm doing is I'm trying to do this as a means to having some kind of connection. So I serve to have this connection with other people. Well, people have gotten used to you as someone who serves, but maybe not intuiting that you're serving for the purpose of connection. And so that gets missed. And then the person who's serving for the means of connection then says enough because it's not coming back way. So they block completely. They're like, I'm done. which confuses people around them because it's like, well, why? What's happened here? Oh, you wanted connection the entire time? What was, I didn't know that, or, I was too narcissistic in some cases to even pay attention to that. That's true too. And then they block that, they cut that off, and then they find themselves even more lonely, even more bereft of connection. So that doesn't work. And so then they ping back and they swing back to the other side, and then it's back to connection, back to serving, back to try to make it happen, right? Because we use the tools we have. It's like that's what we do as humans. And so I think that's why I'm suspicious of the whole boundary movement that's out there, and yet I talk a lot about it. But it's just, I'm part of that as well. But it's just, I'm suspicious as well. And I think I'm skeptical. And I think it's a good skepticism, I hope, that says, well, wait, we don't want to end up in that place where we're so alone because we've set up these boundaries of how people are to interact with us. And many times we set up these boundaries and we're saying, this is how to interact with me. What it does is it also can force people into being something that they're not naturally. So it's like, I need you to be different towards me. I need you to be a certain way that meets my need. That's the extreme end of it.
Yeah, I've awakened to some need in me that I now need you to fulfill.
Yes.
Right.
And the way you normally try to love me that I'm blind to, perhaps, isn't really doing it for me. And so I need you to be different for me. So that's the other extreme that's out there in the world of, boundaries or non-boundaries. And yet, there is a good to that where you start to communicate the ways that actually does serve you, actually meets your need. So there's that. And then there's also the recognition that some of your needs will never be met no matter how much, because it's a bottomless pit, right? So all of our core needs have this sort of bottomlessness to it.
Yeah.
Like if we went through all 9 types, and we've done this before, it's like, how strong do you need to be as an 8 to finally feel like you're strong enough? And you never need to be stronger than that. Like, how much peace do you need to actually finally feel like you're connected to people you need no more to do no more? I mean, we could go down the whole entire list and it would be like, that's true. There isn't enough.
Right.
And so we're trying to get something sometimes from others that could never be met. And at other times, we're completely ignoring our own needs and therefore not getting them met. And then we create boundaries because we're trying to get people to meet our needs the way we'd like them to meet, but it doesn't meet those needs. And then we block them completely because it's not working. It gets very messy.
Yeah. This is why I like our friend Janae's distinction between being under-boundaried and over-boundaried instead of just using the word boundaries. Because I definitely realize that for me, like there's so many areas where it's like, man, I don't have boundaries here. I've got a wall and a moat and it's full of crocodiles and there's hot oil being poured off the wall. Like it's very aggressive. It's not boundaries. I was calling it boundaries, but I think it's all I want people to do when it comes to this stuff is you're going to wake up to something that you don't like and you're going to start putting boundaries in place if you haven't had those before.
Yeah.
Just know that when you do, to a certain extent, you're doing it badly. To a certain extent, it's going to be messy. Like we said, all growth is. It's going to have a messy element to it. There's going to be a certain extent where it's like, I've been ignoring that God-shaped hole. And then now I'm aware of it. I haven't yet woken up to the realization that's unfillable. And so I'm asking for it to be fulfilled.
Sure.
Right. So this thing around boundaries. But the thing is, you still have to wake up to it. And we're kind of off of Mandy's story. Let me bring the certain aspect of it back, which is, Mandy, like, I'm sorry you were in an environment that you felt like you were getting connection as a transaction based on the service you were able to offer. And sometimes there are communities, spiritual environments that it can feel like that. Not that it's intentionally coming from that. I think a lot of times those people have the best at heart, but they're spending the most investment in the volunteers who are showing up the most consistently because they're getting the most time with them. And FaceTime is something that, the consistency of FaceTime is something that we do pay attention to. But I am sorry that you've had that experience. And I do think the way that you talked about boundaries I think this is a loving way to say, it's not saying this is what I can't do. So that's like the barrier. I think rather, this is how we can have a good exchange. Like, this is how we can have a good relationship. And I think it's good to have that at the outset, because what is hard for a lot of people is that switch that you were just talking about, Joel. This where people are used to you in a one way, you decide to show up a different way, and then you're trying to figure something out because it's new to you, and they're trying to figure something out because you suddenly feel new to them. Something's different, something shifted. Did they do something? And they're probably thinking, did I do something wrong? Like, how do I show up? Like, I want to be there for you, but I don't know how, because what does this look like now? And that's the best intention, let alone someone who feels really hurt and betrayed, and they might be triggered, or they might feel like their boundaries are being violated by your new one, whatever. It's like, now we're actually fighting over land.
Right. Yeah.
And that's actually what I see happening in a lot of relationships. It's like both people are like, I'm growing in my boundaries, and now it becomes contested Holy Land.
So I'm glad you're bringing it back to Mandy. Mandy, I think I love what you're saying. It's fantastic. I think I couldn't cheer you on enough. I've actually coached other types through that same process and getting to where you've gotten to. But they've had the same awakening that you did. I'm thinking of my clients right now. If they hear this, they're going to say, "Oh my gosh, they're telling my story here."
Telling my story, right?
Because that's exactly what they realize. It's like, oh, my family only had a transactional relationship with me, or this other community only. And it's absolutely the case that environments oftentimes will support or exploit some of our weaknesses. That happens. When I was pastoring, I've been accused of, the only time you meet with me is when you need something. Right? And it's like, I thought we had a connection. I thought we had a relationship. And after all, you've moved on and you're, pursuing others. And that was helpful for me, painful, but it was helpful for me to hear that, because it woke me up to the ways that we can treat people as means to a particular end that we have. We can also have another motive, that we genuinely do like them. We genuinely do love them even. We do genuinely want the best for them. We can have both happening. That motivation, and then the other motivation of, but I also have a need that I'm trying to meet. And so that definitely does happen as well. So I appreciate that, Mandy, that is the experiences that you have had where you've given out so much, and then realizing like their whole entire time of meeting with me was just because they were nurturing my doing for them, for, my serving them. And it was to keep that going. Yeah. And so that is a painful realization to wake up to. But I love how you've moved through that and moved towards, here's how we can have a relationship, and that's the way that you're creating a boundary.
I think so, but not specific to Mandy's story, because I don't know without asking, more questions. But with a lot of people, when I've heard this kind of binary, like, I thought it was relational, but it turns out it was just transactional. Well, most likely it was actually always a bit of both. Reality is never like a one thing. It's never like it wasn't relational, it was actually transactional. Or most relationships have some kind of a transactional element to them. And that's transactional is not a negative thing. That we are meeting each other in a space where we can fulfill each other's needs in a certain way. We can bring a gift to each other. That is just what it is. Like, we're bringing a gift to each other. And so I think some of the language I hear about this sometimes I do find a little concerning, where it's like, I was with this person, I was dating this person, I was married to this person, I was a friend with this person, and I thought it was like this, but it turns out it was really just like this. I thought we were really close, and it turns out they were just, well, it's probably not just one or the other. It could be a blend, because we also see relationships in really different ways, and over time we change our way that we see them. Like, I was kind of talking to Abby about this one day, where someone that we see, once a month or every couple of months, whatever. And we have lots of people like that. And then there's people that I interact with on a weekly basis, people on maybe even 2 or 3 times a week. But this person had said, who we see every month or so, like, oh, you're like some of our closest friends. And we were both kind of confused by that. We're like, we're some of your closest friends? Like, we see you, every month or two. But for them, it did feel like that like level of closeness. And so it's just, there's so much perspective that comes into play here. I have found it a very important practice in my own growth to question my judgments. Even if I do need to put up a boundary and I'm pulling away from a relationship because of some reason, I have to be honest with myself that I'm doing this for me. I'm not necessarily just doing this because of them or because of something that's going on. The further I get away from some of those events in my life, the more I'm aware of like, it's a pretty mixed bag. Almost always is.
I think that if we are sensitive and perhaps compassionate to the different ways people will experience relationship connection, that won't be the same as ours. And so we extend compassion and understanding, really. Like, oh, that's different. And so I can understand that.
Yeah.
I can be, what we say, maybe bigger hearted around that to like, okay, I can see that that's how you would do that. That for you, that feels real, that feels genuine. You know, a person who says, you know, I don't really need to have a big, deep, open-hearted conversation with a person to feel connected to them. And sometimes just working alongside of them feels very deeply connecting to me. And to another person, it's like, that couldn't be, right? And so now I don't feel like you actually care because blah, 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 and goes on and on and on. It's like, well, right, because we're evaluating through our lens of what that should be. And so I think just being a bit more open-hearted about the fact that we are also very different in our approach to connection. But that does not mean that you don't validate your experience. You validate your experience.
Absolutely.
What I mean is you validate your own sort of heart center experience around that.
Okay, that helps.
It's like, this is what my heart feels.
Yes.
So you don't say, well, you shouldn't feel that way because maybe another person's perspective is this.
Absolutely.
I think that is not what I'm saying at all. Like,
Right.
And we're very consistent about this 3-centered thing. Like,
Yes.
that is your heart's experience. Validate that. It does not need to be justified, does not need to be explained, it does not need anything else to it. It's just that hurts. Absolutely. And we're so sorry for that.
Yeah.
And man, do we experience the same thing ourselves.
Oh,
So,
for sure.
So that's where the heart center is like, okay, we validate the experience of the heart. And then we say, okay, that's the experience of the heart. Now, what about the head center, right? What's its perspective about this thing? And then the body center. What are some, actions that we need to take? What's the right approach to this thing, right? So that's pretty much what I want to say about that. But to say again, we don't know each of your experiences as you share them with us. We don't know what's behind the scenes. We don't know. So we're not coaching anybody through this. We're just simply saying, in broad, this is what we've experienced with people at various different levels. And hopefully some of these tips are really helpful to you all as you're listening to this. So you got to think about boundaries I like that under-boundaried, over-boundaried kind of concept, and to just have that perspective around that. Like, oh yeah, I'm under-boundaried over here. And it's serving a need, right? It's like, I overdid it by serving other people because I had a need. Or I blocked people and took care of my own self because of another need, So,
Well, I like that because, again, that is everything is about the running it through the 3 centers. And that first one is like experiencing your hurt, being honest about it, not doing something with it or feeling like it's just moving through it, allowing yourself to experience the grief. The head center, I think, it usually needs other voices included, otherwise voices. And I'm glad you said that too, because we're not really responding to the story or coaching anyone because this is not the setting for that. Like we've often said, we can't coach through a podcast. This is why we have one-on-one. This is general, and then we get specific for your story in that context. Because if I was talking to any of these wonderful people, I'd have so many questions, for them to reveal like their own wisdom in their own heart. But that's something that you get to do in the head center, and you get to process, you get to question, you get to like nuance, because you want to go through that process so that you can go to the body center of like, well, how do I want to show up differently? How do I want to act in a way that is consistent in loving me and loving the other person?
Yeah.
What does love do in this situation is one of the best questions you can ever ask. What does love do in this situation? that loves all parties present. Like, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah.
And sometimes it is a withdrawal, and sometimes it is in the attempt to work through. And there's not like a one right answer. That does take exploration. And there's so many different things, even in the last couple of years, that I wish I would have done differently if I would have listened to some of that, if I would have walked through some of that. I'm always messing up and learning and trying again, because that's the whole point. I love, one of my favorite Joelisms of all time is, it's not about getting it right, it's about getting back on the path. Because that's really, when it comes to all of this, that's the goal, is to continue the exploration, continue the growth, continue being like, oh, who was it that said every 5 years you should realize that 5 years ago you were full of crap?
Yeah,
like,
that's great.
That whole thing.
That's great. Yes.
It's like, that was, that was several versions of me ago. And I wouldn't see the same thing at all that way now. I wouldn't react the same. I would do this differently. It's like, great. Because otherwise you're just trying to confirm a decision from then.
Oh, totally.
Versus like being in where you are now.
Yeah.
And to love every version of you that was learning along the way.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for listening. Hope this is helpful as you continue to know that it's worth it to grow, even though there are some struggles along the way. The best way to help the show is to leave us a review on iTunes, or share this episode with someone, or any of our episodes with someone, and to sign up for the newsletter at theartofgrowth.org. And you can also follow us on Instagram at just Art of Growth. But for now, my friends, lean in, because it's worth it. And it's not easy. And you might have to tell yourself every day that it's worth it. And it's not easy. But you can do hard things. You can move forward. And the person you're becoming will thank you. But make sure you are a person who continues to welcome others into connection with the new you, because that's when it becomes real. Grace and growth, my friends.